Hello and welcome to the David Icke videocast. Well, there's an old saying that goes, if you don't learn from history, then you are destined to repeat it, and how true that is. And what I'm going to talk about today is how something that was apparently from a past era, the flower power period of the 1960s, when I was a kid growing up, and what is happening today can very much be compared in the way that the young generations are being manipulated to do the establishment's bidding while believing they are challenging it and going against it. For those as old as me, they'll know that the flower power counterculture era of the 1960s was a time when some very strange and amazing things happened. It was the era of opposing the Vietnam War, of copious amounts of LSD. Of course, it was all focused out of California, and it was about peace and love and gentleness. Well, at least on the surface it was. But it turns out that behind the scenes it wasn't like that at all. Quite the opposite. And what is happening today is basically a mirror of that. Young people, not all of them, they've not all bought it, but great numbers of young people have bought the idea of political correctness and all this deletion of freedom of speech, because you can't say that because you can't be nasty, or if you say something we don't believe and or accept, then you're a bigot and a racist and a misogynist and transphobic and all this stuff. And they think they're standing up for what's right and what's good, when actually the establishment's playing them like a one of those. Just as the flower power era young generation was played in the same way. And I've been reading this book this week. Came out a few years ago, and unfortunately the author, David McGowan, a brilliant researcher and writer and investigator into what the mainstream would never look at. David unfortunately has died since the book came out, but he's left a fantastic legacy in the books that he wrote, and in this one, which completely exposes the truth about the era of flower power and the counterculture. Yeah, right. And it's called Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon, Laurel Canyon, Covert Ops, and the Dark Heart of the Hippie Dream. Now, David McGowan loved the 60s. He loved its music. So did I. And therefore, he's not coming from a point of view of, oh, it's a load of rubbish, I'm going to trash it. He thought it was a good time. He loved it. But like all researchers worth the name, like all pursuers of truth who really mean it, you put aside what you thought about a situation at the time, and you go in search of the truth about what it was really all about. And people look back at the 60s and this flower power counterculture era, and they think, yeah, it was all out of San Francisco, Summer of Love, 1967. Well, it expressed itself eventually through San Francisco, Flowers in Your Hair. But actually, the whole thing began in a very small area of Los Angeles called Laurel Canyon. And the number of iconic 60s counterculture stimulating bands and personalities that came out of that small area called Laurel Canyon was absolutely extraordinary, as was the fact that 60s musical icon after 60s musical icon coming out of Laurel Canyon just happened to come from military and military intelligence families. So what you had here, as Gowan brilliantly documents, is military families, overwhelmingly from Washington, D.C. and that area, that were for the Vietnam War, that were for the establishment, big time, and the military establishment, had their children move from the East Coast and the Washington, D.C. area massively to Los Angeles and Laurel Canyon at around the same time. And they created a movement that claimed to be against the Vietnam War. Now, you could say, oh yeah, they were just going against their parents, but you read the book and you'll realize that the coincidences, the numbers, who all did the same, from the same backgrounds, is absolutely beyond the bounds of coincidence. Now, here's some of the bands that came out of this very small area of Los Angeles called Laurel Canyon. Jim Morrison and the Doors, The Byrds, Frank Zappa, by the way, who was vehemently a supporter of the military. Hey, peace, man, peace and love, stop the war. The Mamas and Papas, Buffalo Springfield, Stephen Stills, Neil Young, who of course would form Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. Members of the Monkees lived in Laurel Canyon, and members of the Beach Boys, and also a record producer and later murderer, maybe not so late, Phil Spector. On and on and on it went. And also out of that Laurel Canyon came a dance group led by a very dodgy and shady character. And from that dance group came the whole hippie phenomenon, including the clothes that hippies wore, and many still do. All out of this small area. And right in the middle of Laurel Canyon was a major facility run by the US Air Force and later the CIA called Lookout Mountain Laboratory, which, according to McGowan's book, produced 19,000 classified motion pictures, more than all the Hollywood studios nearby put together. And these films involved Hollywood names like Jimmy Stewart, Bing Crosby, Ronald Reagan, Walt Disney, Marilyn Monroe, the director John Ford, again, on and on it goes. And just as an aside, also living on that Lookout Mountain in the 1960s was a young film student called Steven Spielberg. You may have heard of him. And along with the bands that would drive the hippie flower power phenomenon in Laurel Canyon, and with connections to Laurel Canyon, even if they didn't live there, was a group of Hollywood big names, actors, actresses. And among them were, one of the collective names for them at the time was the Young Turks. They included Dennis Hopper, Peter Fonda, Jack Nicholson, Warren Beatty, who all had connections to Laurel Canyon or homes there. Others with connections to the canyon were Sharon Tate and her husband, the still on the run paedophile, Roman Polanski. And it was Tate, of course, that was brutally murdered in 1969 by Charles Manson's satanic cult, according to the official story anyway, which was known as the Family. And murder, as is so documented by the book, murder and Laurel Canyon and people who lived there who had or had connections there is just absolutely staggering. And Charles Manson had great connections there with these big name artists of the 1960s. So it weren't really how it was portrayed, but a whole generation, or at least a great chunk of that generation, not all of it, were pulled into this whole idea that it was a spontaneous, out of nowhere response to the Vietnam War. And just read you this little summary at one point in Dave McGowan's book, where he's just at the end of a chapter, and he's just summarizing how far we've got. And this is what he says. So let's wrap up this chapter with a quick review of what we have learned about the people populating Laurel Canyon in the mid to late 60s. We know that one subset of residents was a large group of musicians who all decided, nearly simultaneously, to flood into the canyon. The most prominent members of this group were, to an overwhelming degree, the sons and daughters of the military intelligence community. We also know that mingled in with them were the young stars of Hollywood, who were also, to an astonishing degree, the sons and daughters of the military intelligence community. And finally, we know that also in the mix were scores of military intelligence personnel who operated out of the facility known as Lookout Mountain Laboratory. I've got to say, given the relatively small size of Laurel Canyon, I'm beginning to wonder if there was any room left over for any normal folks who might have wanted to live the rock and roll lifestyle. And a wonderful example is Jim Morrison. Jim Morrison was the lead singer in a band called The Doors, a massive, iconic personality and band of this 60s era. And The Doors were named after a book written by Brave New World author Aldous Huxley called The Doors of Perception, which was a book about psychedelic, as we would call them now, mind-changing drugs. And Jim Morrison came from a military family. And I mentioned there the Vietnam War. Well, the Vietnam War, in its full-blown horror, was launched and justified after something called the Gulf of Tonkin incident. And what happened, it was a classic, what I call problem reaction solution, or actually no problem reaction solution, because the US establishment under the President Lyndon Johnson, who replaced John F. Kennedy, who wanted to start to withdraw out of the Vietnam situation. One of the reasons that Kennedy was killed, only one. And when Lyndon Johnson replaced him, of course, he and the establishment all wanted to have a full-blown Vietnam War. But they had to have an excuse. So there were some American warships in the Gulf of Tonkin, just off Vietnam, who claimed that they'd been attacked by North Vietnamese gunboats. It turns out, with the passage of history, that such an attack never happened. They made it up. But Lyndon Johnson picked it up, went immediately to Congress, and got permission to have the full-blown war, basically, in Vietnam. But at its peak, something like 500,000 American troops, conscripts, the vast overwhelming majority didn't want to be there, were deployed to Vietnam. It led to 50,000 American troops being killed, well, between 50 and 60,000 if you add it all together. And the deaths of millions of people, overwhelmingly civilians, in Vietnam, in Laos, in Cambodia. Well, here's where I'm going with this. The admiral leading those warships in the Gulf of Tonkin that scammed an attack that didn't happen, which led to the Vietnam War in its full-blown expression, was the father of Jim Morrison. And Jim Morrison would go from being a regular American kid to this, again, iconic figure in a very short time. That would be part of this whole movement to, in part, challenge the Vietnam War and also project all this drug-filled peace and love. And there were many reasons why the establishment wanted this to happen. And one of them was that they wanted to marginalize and basically hijack the feet on the ground anti-Vietnam War movement and have the whole focus of opposition taken over by people who overwhelmingly, and the people who got caught up in it, were genuine, but behind the scenes was being orchestrated by the very establishment they thought they were opposing. Exactly what is happening today. And in terms of Jim Morrison, Dave McGowan says this, and you start to see just some of the connections. I mean, the connections are unbelievable when you read the book. He says here about Jim Morrison, let's suppose, hypothetically speaking, that you happen to be Jim Morrison and have recently arrived in Laurel Canyon and now find yourself fronting a band that is on the verge of taking the country by storm. Just a mile or so down Laurel Canyon Boulevard from you lives another guy who also recently arrived in Laurel Canyon and who also happens to front a band on the verge of stardom. He happens to be married to a girl that you attended kindergarten with, and her dad, like yours, was involved in atomic weapons research and testing. Admiral George Morrison, for a time, did classified work at White Sands, the weapons testing center. He goes on, her husband's dad, meanwhile, is involved in another type of WMD research, chemical warfare. The other guy's business partner manager is a spooky ex-Marine who just happens to have a cousin who, bizarrely enough, also fronts a rock band on the verge of superstardom. And this third rock star on the rise also happens to live in Laurel Canyon, just a mile or two from your house, just down a couple of other streets, also within the distance of your home, walking distance of your home, live two other kids who, wouldn't you know it, also happen to front a new rock and roll band. These two kids happen to attend the same Alexandria, Virginia high school that you attended, and one of them also attended Annapolis, that's where there's a big naval academy, Annapolis, just like your dad did, and just like your kindergarten friend's dad did. Now, this is only a small part of it. Though most all of you hail from Washington, D.C., or that area, you now find yourselves on the opposite side of the country in an isolated canyon above the city of Los Angeles, where you are all clustered around a secret military installation. Given his background in research on atomic weapons, your father is probably familiar to some extent with the existence and operations of the Lookout Mountain Laboratory, as is the father of your kindergarten friend. The question that naturally arises here, I suppose, is this. What do you suppose the odds are that all of that just came together purely by accident? It's brilliant research in this book, which I read some articles by him a long time ago, so a lot of it was familiar to me because of that, but there's some really fantastic research in there that shows that the whole counterculture, this is the point, the whole counterculture challenging the establishment era of the 60s was all kind of manipulated by that same establishment. And there was, as usual, as you would expect with an establishment operation, Satanism involved, and there was paedophilia involved, as usual on an industrial scale. And when you've got a Mamas and the Papas song, which is called 1230, Young Girls Coming to the Canyon, or words close to that, a Mamas and the Papas hit, they were actually telling a story there that was literally true. They were. And then you had a guy called Phillips, one of the singers in the Mamas and Papas, who wrote a song called San Francisco for his friend, a guy called Scott McKenzie, with a classic Summer of Love song, San Francisco, where people, young people, many of them runaways, waifs and strays, were urged to go to San Francisco. Are you going to San Francisco? Where the people wear flowers in their hair, and you'll meet some gentle people there. Well, actually, the 60s was about peace, love, gentleness. Well, in the hearts of many of the people who were pulled into that, it was. And for many, it still will be. But behind the scenes, the people pulling the strings, running the show, they were into anything but peace, love, and gentleness. McGowan documents in great detail the horror list of happenings in Laurel Canyon and connected to these personalities and these forces that created the counterculture era, as it was called. I've written some down here. The Laurel Canyon death list, for a start. I mean, it's shocking. It basically is definitely on a par or even greater than the body count of the Clintons over the decades. The number of people who died in that canyon, or people connected to that canyon who died, often by a series of suicides that most of them clearly weren't, and how these personalities again and again had parents who committed suicide. It was extraordinary when you look at the size of the place and the number of people involved. Houses burning down. Houses of the rich and famous in Laurel Canyon that just burnt down with no explanation. Can't wait to move there. Other themes, like I say, Satanism. And as you would expect, with Charles Manson so closely connected to Laurel Canyon, and with the canyon so closely connected to Hollywood, both in terms of distance and the personalities, then you're always going to have Satanism involved, because Hollywood and Satanism are basically interchangeable terms if you go to the controlling level of it. And the families of some Laurel Canyon stars were connected, and I was not in the least surprised when I read this, to the massive and infamous CIA mind control operation called MK Ultra, which was exposed even in congressional hearings. Well, part of it was. And it's very clear when you read about descriptions of the personalities of many of these people, these big 60s stars, that they were under MK Ultra mind control. Because again and again you read of people and you read of friends talking about them in terms of their personalities just switching in an instant from one kind of personality to another. And this and many other descriptions of them are classic traits of multiple personality disorder, or what is more called today dissociative identity disorder, where people have different programmed personalities and they switch between them, so you don't know who you're talking to. It's like talking to a group of people, not one. And that's classic MK Ultra, which was all involved in this flower power era. And this is all happening in a period when the people involved, in terms of the masses drawn in, thought that a counterculture was taking place. And there was this fierce rebellion against the establishment. The establishment, counterculture. Well, first of all, during the 60s, because of the Vietnam War, there was the draft. And young people were drafted into the military to go and fight, to kill and be killed in Vietnam. Almost none of them wanted to go. And yet, these major names were not subject to the draft. And some of the explanations of how they got out of the draft are just ridiculous. They were, of course, drowning in drugs, illegal drugs. And some of them that were caught did not get anything like the sentence, sometimes no sentence at all, when others would have been in jail for years. And then you look at the record companies and the promotion of their music. The point being that if the establishment wanted to crush that counterculture in the 60s, then it could have done. Quite easy. You draft the major stars, you put them in jail for drug offenses, you don't promote them, you don't have them on television, you don't give them record contracts. But that is what happened. Because the establishment wanted it to happen for many reasons, including what I mentioned about the Vietnam War. And of course, the minds of the young, many of the young, not all of them, I mean, I was young at that time, and I wasn't into all this drug stuff, I just loved the music. But many people were. They got caught in it, particularly in the United States, particularly in California, what's all coming out of. And so you had a generation, or great chunks of it, that thought they were involved in a counterculture, that thought they were involved in a a challenge to the establishment in their often drug state, when actually the establishment was running the show. And in terms of the whole drug culture and a lot of the way that people saw the 60s, you can come to a guy called Timothy Leary. He was a clinical psychologist at Harvard University. And he was one of the big personalities, the big names of this 60s so-called counterculture. And he's most famous for his phrase, turn on, tune in, drop out. That was the phrase that he repeated, and then others repeated too. Turn on, tune in, drop out. And later, Leary said, I give the CIA the total credit for sponsoring and initiating the entire counterculture movement, counterculture events of the 1960s. Because it was the CIA that overwhelmingly was circulating the drugs, the LSD. And they were in league with a company in Switzerland called Sandoz in Basel, Switzerland, that was producing this stuff. So wherever you look, the military intelligence, government establishment is there in this so-called counter culture. And then out of this also started to emerge in the same period what became known as the New Age movement, which was basically a westernized version of the Eastern religions. And my observation, there's some very nice people and some very aware people in what is being called the New Age movement. But I've met so many over the years that have used what they call spirituality, not as a means of change, but a means of escape from what they don't want to face. Oh, don't talk about that conspiracy, it's negative. And if we're going to make any difference in the world, Mr. Leary, we don't have to drop out, we have to start dropping in and engaging with what's really going on and doing what is necessary to stop what is really going on. And so what you see in the whole counterculture 60s era is basically controlled opposition, where you control those pushing for what you want, including the Vietnam War, but you also control those at the level that it's coming from, who are apparently opposing what you want. So you control the game. You want to control a football match, and you want to know the outcome before the first ball is kicked. You can't control one side. You'll influence the match, but you won't know the outcome before it starts. But if you control both sides and the referee, you know what the score's going to be before the game starts. And that's how this controlled opposition works. It was Vladimir Lenin who said that the best way to control the opposition is to run it yourself, basically. Words to that effect. And so to today, we're seeing this illiberal, progressive mindset, as it's called, thinking that it's challenging the establishment, because then it's mine now, the establishment is Trump, when it's being manipulated in exactly the same way in theme that happened in the 1960s. This establishment, this hidden hand, this deep state through which it expresses itself, want divide and rule, a fundamental state for any few that want to control the many. So they have now manipulated the so-called progressive mindset and that which supports Trump into polarizing into basically a political debate that goes, we hate Trump, we love Trump. That's it. Trump says something, it's all wrong. Trump says something, it's all right. And what is happening in terms of divide and rule is exactly what the establishment want. And why, one major reason why, not the only one, that Trump was brought to power as this divisive character that would stimulate this polarization. So the target population are at war with itself, war with themselves, and then the puppet masters controlling both sides can then do what they like without challenge. So then you have the progressive mindset, brackets C60s counterculture, that is the driving force behind political correctness and telling people in ever finer detail what they are and are not allowed to say. Now, what does the establishment want? It wants all opposition to its agenda silenced. It wants all challenging and questioning of its official narrative silenced and censored. And now it has manipulated vast numbers of an entire generation, and of course that's filtered through into the adult world as well, big time, that are acting as censors on its behalf, while many of them think that they are anti-establishment, that think they're anti-fascist, while doing exactly what the fascists did and the communists did, which is to destroy all opposition and all information circulating that exposes what they're doing. But just as those who got caught in the illusory counterculture of the 60s, so today you have people behaving exactly like the Nazis did in terms of censorship and silencing other opinions, who believe they are heart on the sleeve liberals who are anti-fascist. And just as the establishment was laughing its socks off in the 60s, so it is laughing its socks off now. We have a situation where the equivalent today of the counterculture, that once in the counterculture era at least opposed the power of corporations, the power of government, opposed censorship of free speech. Now it's been flipped so that it's against all those things, but it's still the same principle. And these days, instead of drugging the targets with LSD, they're drugging them with pharmaceutical drugs on a vast bloody scale. But all the elements are there. We have people who actually believe that billionaire manipulators like George Soros is a good guy who cares about the world and cares about what they care about, simply because he bankrolls to the tune of tens of billions the organizations that seem to be standing for what they've been manipulated to stand for. All it needs to complete the set now is for George Soros to move to Laurel Canyon. And you know, older people have now become increasingly persona non grata in this brave new world. And it's true that there is no fool like an old fool. If you've lived a life of 60, 70 years or more, and you've learned nothing, then there is no fool like an old fool. But if you've lived 50, 60, 70 years, and you have had the intelligence to learn, to observe, to perceive from that experience, then you can be a fountain of wisdom and experience for those who are much younger and haven't had that ability to perceive and experience as you have, because they've not been here long enough. But of course, in this all or nothing, black and white, you're for us or against us, crazy world, all older people are just written off, especially if they're male and white, by the way. Because we're anti-sexist and we're anti-racist. But if you have lived through many periods of happenings, you can see the patterns. You can therefore see history repeating. As those who are involved in one happening and have not experienced all the others will not see. So I say to young people, those who've been caught, lots of them haven't, don't repeat history while thinking you are part of a brave new world. Because what we are seeing, again, in the techniques that are being used and the outcomes that are being planned, and the control of the potential opposition, is history repeating. Please don't fall for it.